We are back again with Dr. Burak Yilmaz of Harmony Public Schools and Tamara Cheng of the KIPP Foundation. Thank you both for joining us today to talk about applying for competitive federal grants outside of the charter schools program. So now we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about how to set yourself up for success if you decide to apply for a competitive federal grant. So looking back to when your networks first started applying to federal grants, I mean, within the time and capacity that you have been with your organizations, what made you feel ready to start applying? And I'd like to start with Burak.
Sure. I think what motivated us to apply for the first time was we were piloting a new approach to teaching STEM subjects, and we are a STEM focused network. And we had some amazing feedback from both students and teachers. This was the first time we were doing project-based learning in a small scale. This was back in 2010, 11. Students were so much more engaged in science and technology classes, and the demand for high-level advanced STEM courses was increasing as a result of this approach. But the program was just too costly for us to scale to all of our high schools or secondary schools. We were very excited and hungry to scale this approach, but didn't have the financial means to do so. So seeing that we had a successful pilot and huge demand from the community, we knew that we had a great, honest story that could award us a big grant. So that was how we knew we were ready.
Thanks for that. And Tamara, same question. How did you know you were ready to start applying for these big grants?
As Burak mentioned, there was already like an established program. So that is like my one piece of advice. If you know you're ready, is you have something that is ready to scale. And so we had an established leadership program called the Fisher Fellowship and the Successor Prep program. And we knew the programs have been running for a while now. But I think, KIPP, in the spirit of like continuous improvement, was looking at like what tweaks and changes do we have to make to this program to get the student outcomes that we were really looking for. Are we selecting, is our selection criteria really selecting the best leaders for these school leader positions? And so I think the SEED grant was an opportunity to get funding to really look at our leadership development program and evaluate what was working and what wasn't working so that we can make those changes to the program moving forward.
Yeah, so it sounds like having something nascent that you want to scale is really helpful when you start to apply for a big grant. How did you all think about the pros and cons of applying for a federal grant versus philanthropic funding? Burak?
Well, for my organization, we were never too big on philanthropic funding. I think we started receiving more philanthropic funding in recent years, and I have personally not been involved in our projects that were funded with philanthropic dollars. It was mainly they were focused on physical expansion of the network size, and I work more on the program side. But as far as the federal grant funding goes, I think in comparison, yes, there's definitely more paperwork, reporting, data collection, etc. But we don't see this as a burden. We see it as a required healthy accountability because part of the grant is you want to prove yourself that you're using these dollars with great impacts, great outcomes, and all of that comes as part of that accountability. And also the departments usually contracts with seasoned education consulting firms to provide cost-free technical assistance to grantees, which is a plus, which I may be wrong, but probably doesn't come with many philanthropic grants.
I think that's true. Tamara, same question. How did you consider philanthropy versus federal grants?
I think KIPP is an equal opportunity fundraiser, if I'm being very honest. And so, and I come from more of the finance fundraising side of the house than the implementation program side. With philanthropic dollars, I would say there's more flexibility, and it really depends on the partner or the donor you're working with, right? So if you're dealing with like a individual who's giving, that relationship and expectation is very different from a foundation, like maybe a Gates Foundation, where they're a bit more structured and have like a very standard way of how they want to work with their grantees. With federal grants, you know, from a federal agency, there's a lot more rules and compliance that you have to read up on and learn. But to Burak's point, I think the positive of that is like it's really impressive, to get a federal grant, to know that your organization is well run and well managed to handle that kind of thing. And as again mentioned, like the outcomes that come out of receiving a federal grant, especially when there's research, there's a research requirement, like that is, and it's peer reviewed, right? It's a very rigorous like process. And so like the outcomes and the evidence that you get out of that project is held to a very high standard. And we've used the study that came out of our I3 grant to use for other fundraising opportunities. So, you know, when they say like, why should we fund KIPP? We said, well, you know, we have this rigorous study that was funded by the U.S. Department of Education that showed this, and that was really like, I don't know, like a gold star that KIPP could show in as evidence for other opportunities to partner with other donors or foundations.
So it sounds like for you guys, it's like both and,
right? Like we apply for philanthropic funding all the time. We apply for federal funding all the time. Why limit yourself? Federal grants is intimidating. And you know, it's a lot more, there are a lot more rules and requirements and stuff like that. But I think don't get too scared about it. It's as Burak mentioned, the other thing I'll mention, the Department of Education is very used to working with schools. And so they're used to working with organizations that might be novice applicants. It's like the first time getting a federal grant. And so they will provide technical assistance, and they have these outside consultants and contractors that will work with you one-on-one on all the different pieces, including the financial, the compliance, or the paperwork, or your annual report. So you do get that support. It is provided. And you are allowed to, in your budget, build in a grant coordinator or a grant manager, so you can hire someone in-house for the duration of the grant to manage it if that is something you need. So that is another kind of like way of, if federal grants sound scary, it's another way of setting yourself up, having the resources to set yourself up for success.
Yeah, that makes sense. Burak, could you tell us a little bit about what the process of applying was like? Did you have to apply multiple times before you were successful, for example?
Sure. I mean, we went through more than 5 successful grant cycles. I think we've always received grant awards after our first application in each competition, with the exception of one. I think for the EIR grants, we applied for 2 years in a row. We missed the award by a small margin after the first application, but won the competition in the second round. Other than that, it was always in the first go around. But the process of applying is always quite a heavy lift, because from the time the department releases the notice of intent to apply, they call it NIA, to the time of submission deadline, it is usually a narrow window, usually about 4 to 5 weeks. So it can be overwhelming, especially if you are working on other big time-bound projects. So that's a very intensive process. In order to meet this demanding timeline and submit a robust proposal, We set up a committee with key players to brainstorm ideas. We collect a lot of data, pull a lot of reports, and we create a story ultimately. And we also work with professional grant writers to adhere to all the proposal requirements and to help us figure out the best storyline. So that's what the process is like.
Yeah. Burak, you mentioned that you missed by a couple of points in your first application for one of the grants. Could you clarify for everyone who's listening what that means to miss by a couple of points?
So the departments at the end of each grant application cycle, when they go through and finalize their reviews and they announce the winners on their websites, but for all of the applicants, they send back a review summary with comments and scores of whoever reviewed and scored their proposals. So multiple comments and scores from their review panel. So that's anonymous, of course, but you see like how you scored on each portion of the application and some of the feedback comments, like why they ducked points if you didn't get full points in certain areas. And you can compare those to the winning proposals and how they performed against yours. So that's how you might actually know like you weren't selected, if it's by a wide margin or a small margin. And sometimes they only fund like 10, 12, 15, or 20 applicants, depending on the availability of funding. So if you're like, if they funded one more, it would have been us because it's just such a small point difference.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah.
Tamara, same question. Is there anything you want to add about what the process of applying is like? Does KIPP work with a professional grant writer, or do you write grants in-house?
We're fortunate enough to do grants in-house, but you know, it's a cross-team effort, right? So you have to build a budget. We have on our development fundraising team, we have the grant writer who writes the narrative, you know, the story, the compelling evidence. The other thing I would add is, again, carefully read all the priorities on the criteria of your grant application and make sure you're addressing all those priorities and criteria directly in your project narrative. As Burak mentioned, they score everything based on how you're able to meet those priorities and evidence. And so like meeting underserved student needs is like one of their priorities, and you get 20 points, a maximum of 20 points for that section. And so we would even break it down, like if something was worth 5 points, we would spend 5 points amount of time working on that section, but if something was worth 20 points, like this is a critical section, so we have to really like put a lot of focus on that section. As Burak mentioned, they don't give you a lot of time from once they release the NIA to when you have to hit submit. So we would like strategize in that way, like which sections are worth the most points. Like that's really focus on those sections. That's like a tip. And then there's also like, you know, another thing, make sure you have all your registrations. So like you have to be registered in sam.gov and have a specific number to be even eligible to get federal funding. So make sure you have that all set up. And my other tip is to build everything offline because you submit everything in the scary grants.gov portal. And, you know, so build everything offline so that you can just upload it into their online portal to submit. And you know it's the government, and the government and technology doesn't always go well. So some of the systems are just old, you know, they're not the most innovative new application system. So you have to, you know, work through that clunky system. And so that is my other tip, is to try to hit submit you know, at least a day before the deadline. And it is always due DC time. That's my other thing that you should be aware of.
Yeah, so Tamara mentioned a lot of important things right there. So first of all, the NIA or the notice inviting applications, that's going to come out with a pretty short window. It can depend from year to year how long a window will be for a given grant. And as she said, it's going to include criteria and priorities that are going to have points attached to them. So like part of this is around like time management and planning, thinking about how can you prioritize these points. And then of course, there's these nuts and bolts things like grants.gov. I would recommend applying for those things and the registrations for them immediately once you decide that you're going to apply for the grant. And I believe you could submit your application multiple times. So you can also submit early. And if you want to make edits and revisions, you can still come back and do that up until that midnight cutoff, which will always be Eastern time on the day that the applications are due. So thank you for all of that. I'd like to talk a little bit now about what you have going on inside of your organizations to help you run a complex grant like this. So thinking about the internal capacities and controls that you have in place in order to be ready to apply and to successfully manage a grant. So let's stay with Tamara for this one. What sort of capacities do you have and controls do you have in place to be ready for grants?
Sure. What we have in place internally, we have a federal grants specialist on our finance team. And I know not everyone can hire someone just to specialize in federal funding on their team. And so my advice there is either hire outside expertise, like a third-party provider, or use your grant to hire that person or have that person work on your grant temporarily if you're lucky enough to get it. So we have on our finance team, we have people who are knowledgeable in uniform guidance, which is the guidance uniform guidance is the financial regulations that you need to know for managing direct federal funding. And the other thing is internally, we had to be able to go through the single audit, right? So your finance team, your auditors have, your finance team has to be ready for a single audit. And the single audit is basically if you receive $750K or more in federal funding, you have to go through this special audit. And so you have to make sure that, so internally at KIPP, our finance team is like, we know how to go through that audit, and that's the other thing. And, you know, you have to have, you know, the correct controls in place. So you have to have fund accounting set up. So your finance team has to be able to actively manage those funds and all the expenses charged to those funds separate from all your other fundings. And the last thing I will say, if you are going to be charging personnel to your grant, you have to have a robust time and effort system of because you know, to meet federal regulations, only the allowable time personnel can charge on a grant is the time that they spent working directly on that project. So I'll give an example. If you have a trainer in your program, somebody who is doing leadership coaching, but they're not always coaching the leaders in the program being funded by your federal grant, that person needs to be able to split their time between when they're working on federal grant activities and when they're not working on federal grant activities. So you have to have those robust systems and policies in place in order to manage the federal funding appropriately and not get into trouble because as I mentioned before, it's extremely rigorous. These are tax dollars appropriated by Congress, and so there's a lot more scrutiny attached to it. So you really have to have these robust systems and policies in place internally, and that's kind of what we've set up internally at KIPP in-house. But again, if you're a smaller organization, like you can either hire someone from your grant or work with an outside third-party provider to get that in support and expertise.
Yeah, thanks for all that, Tamara. Burak, do you have anything you wanted to add to that in terms of internal capacities and controls?
Sure. So similar to KIPP, as Tamara described, we also have a grant team within our finance departments, but they're primarily involved in applying for non-discretionary grants like title funds. They manage all of those from A to Z. And they're only involved in competitive grants like TSL in the fiscal management after it is awarded, not during the application stage. So during the application stage, we have a director of development who identifies opportunities, funding opportunities, and helps form the team and recruit grant writers. And it comes down to that forming a team of usually 5 to 7 key leaders. So we set aside time to do idea brewing and data pulling and narrative writing or revising. And I think one of the most important things I would say is having strong data systems, because during that application phase, you need to be able to pull a lot of data in a short amount of time, analyze them, and create compelling narratives and arguments as evidence to those absolute priorities and how you're addressing them. So without strong data systems, sometimes even that pulling data and creating reports can be very time consuming and you don't have a lot of time. I think the last 3 or 4 competitions we entered always had a timeline around the end of the school year, like starting from late May all the way to late June. And that was ideal because we can put more hours into the grant writing, especially after that first week of June. Since school is out and we have less distractions and less urgent tasks. But the caveat is a lot of the folks on our team would go on vacation, so that the fortunate team who are tasked with building the proposal would have to sometimes delay their vacation and work on the proposal writing all through June. But when you win it, it's all worth it.
Definitely.
I feel your pain. I had to submit CSP over winter break by myself on Christmas Day. Like it was not great. And the other thing, the data thing is, I just want to underline that our data team always gets really nervous whenever we apply for another federal grant, because they're just like, oh my God, like what more do you want us to do? And so we've also tried to very intentionally, like, what are the metrics? What are we already collecting? And could we put that as potential project measures in our grant application? Like, these are the metrics we're already using. So that is another like helpful tip, is if there is a lot of data collection requirements, and try to use the metrics and the data you already have in your proposal rather than inventing new ones just for your grant.
And I would say,
and I think that's a great tip.
Yeah, even when you come into that application phase with a big picture idea of what you're going to put in the proposal, in order to really make strong arguments and back them up with data and research, you usually come up with spontaneous ideas and that require data and reports. And right after that meeting, you need those reports on the same day or the next day. You don't have the luxury of waiting around a few days or a week or two until that report or data comes. So I understand the data folks really feeling overwhelmed, but that's the nature of the application phase.
Yeah, absolutely. Tamara mentioned this earlier about staffing, but did you all hire additional staff to take on these grants once you received them? So what were the roles you added and why, if you did add them? And then secondarily, did you fund them with the grant or with another funding source? Let's go to Tamara.
So it was, again, a little bit of both. We had like in staff person, but for some of our grants, again, the timing, like they give you 30 days to turn it around. And so from the application process, we actually hired an outside grant writer to just help with just like reading all the requirements and like summarizing what we needed to do. And then once we got the grant itself, depends on the grant and the scope. So For CSP, we don't add additional FTEs on the grant. That's CSP is like a grant we're very used to, and we have the in-house FTEs to really manage that. For SEED, there are some, like, again, it was a little bit requirement driven. So like SEED, there was like a sharing portion requirement where you just share best practices with other charters or districts. And so for that grant specifically, we did put in a 5-year grant term limited FTE to provide, to translate KIPP's professional development programming and share those best practices with outside charters, other charter school networks and districts. And so that, because it was kind of almost like a requirement of the grant, we put that FTE into our grant budget.
Thanks for that. Same question, Burak. Have you hired additional roles to manage grants? And if so, did you fund them with your grant funding or with another source?
Yes, in every grant we were awarded, there has been at least one, and usually 2 full-time grant management team. One person would serve as the project director or the executive lead, which has always been me in our organization in that role. And one other person, and sometimes we would actually, depending on the projects, we would split that into 2 part-time employees to really leverage their different expertise, working as project managers or grant facilitators. Because in our case, with the existing capacity we have, for example, from the grants team, they are already handling all the fiscal requirements, the drawdowns and the reportings. But the management team we have are more heavily focused on the design and rollout of projects, as well as the ongoing implementation support.
So it sounds like you need additional folks to implement these grants,
definitely.
which is understandable, I think. And kind of on that same note, how does managing a competitive federal grant like SEED or TSL compare to other grants you might have received, such as the Charter Schools Program or CSP grants? Like, is there a difference in terms of how you approach the management of it? Let's stay with Burak.
So managing TSL has been pretty similar to TIF grants, for example, and somewhat similar to EIR, those 2 previous grants. I've managed 5 grant cycles in the past 11 years, and there was usually an overlap between multiple grants, so the math doesn't add up. And in my experience managing all these grants, my experience was pretty much the same in all of them, except for Race to the Top, which was our very first grant. So that one was a much more fun and enjoyable experience. I mean, they're all fun and enjoyable because you accomplish great things, but it was really elevated levels for 2 reasons. One, the program managers at the US Department of Ed were so much more involved, and this can be perceived as negative, but they were involved in a positive way. They provided so much hands-on support, connecting us to industry experts and expert seasoned consultants, and working with us to create exemplar case studies on our implementation. I mean, they really worked hard to identify what each grantee is doing unique and really well, and produce like bright spot case studies. And they would throw these amazing grantee convenings to leverage all the learning and networking. And the Secretary of Education would appear and talk to all the grantees, which never happens now. So I guess in that sense, Race to the Top was a very special project due to maybe presidential involvements. And at the end of the program, there was a listening session where all the superintendents of grantees were invited to the White House. So that was a big closing.
Yeah, Tamara, same question. How do these competitive federal grants compare to managing CSP, for example?
I think they're very similar. I know applying sounds really scary, but like once you've gotten one, you kind of really learn the whole like grant cycle, the expectations with your program officer, and developing that relationship with someone at the Department of Education. Then like the next federal grant is going to be much easier. So it's actually, I think KIPP, because KIPP had such a long history with CSP, that going after these other grants wasn't as scary because it was like very similar in how you apply and how you manage it and in how you, you know, submit reports and stuff like that. And I will also add the only thing that shifts is indeed changes in administration. So just like the expectation and the relationship with your program officer might change, and it did change with KIPP, you know, between Obama to Trump to Biden, depending on who is now in charge of the department and what their relationship with charters and what they require from the grantees. So that did kind of shift. It was almost like a more political. So CSP, the CSP program, for example, changed a lot between Obama and Trump, and then it changed again between Trump and Biden, and what their expectations and charters were, and that trickled down to the grants themselves and how the program officer like managed the grants with their grantees. So that did shift. You know, the political environment did have an impact on grants, but you know, like the fundamentals of like getting a grant and managing a grant, that like as I mentioned, my experience before working at KIPP was at a university where I was managing federal grants, but from different agencies. And I found like transitioning from a different federal agency to the Department of Education was actually really similar. So again, I think the biggest hurdle is just getting your first couple in federal grants and getting really familiar and building that expertise. And once you know it, like they're very, very similar.
Yeah, thanks for that. Looking back a little bit and then looking forward for other folks who might potentially want to apply, and you both have mentioned a few of these, but what are some of the tips or recommendations you would have in terms of prep work that you think schools or networks should do before they decide to apply for a grant? So I've heard that you should already have a nascent project, you should already have like folks on staff who understand the fiscal management, things like that. But what are some of the other tips that you would want to share with folks? Let's go to Burak first.
I think looking at their historic successes and also challenges, pain points, is definitely helpful to create that story. Having readily available data is super important. Strong data systems is a big plus in making that whole process effective. And budget planning. I think you need to have a strong sense of the markets and cost projections in terms of the services and areas you want to spend your grant funds on is super helpful. But overall, I guess the secret is to really try and be your most innovative self in terms of the ideas you put in the grants, but making sure at the same time not to overpromise. I mean, knowing yourself and your organization, knowing your limits and capabilities, and making sure you only promise what you can deliver is important. I think identifying the project implementation team beforehand and involving them in the grant writing, or at least the project design phase, is key. Because, I mean, we haven't had this issue, but we've seen in many peer grantees when leadership changes after the grant is awarded, that often poses implementation challenges and create buy-in issues. Yeah, those are some of the ideas I can share.
Yeah, same question to you then, Tamara. What would you add about the prep work and supports you think folks should have in place before they consider applying?
I mean, very similar. Is it a good fit? Like, it has to be a good fit. You can't just go, force your way into applying just because you need the financial resources, right? Because once you get it, it will be, if it's not a good fit or you kind of fudge some things to make it a good fit, it's going to come out in the wash. To be blunt, it's going to come out the other end once you get the grant. So again, fit, make sure it really take a hard look at the requirements, the scoring, what the priorities are. Will you be able to really meet those priorities? And these grants are typically 3 to 5 years. And so make sure, you will be able to meet those commitments for the next 3 and 5 years. And again, is this part of our KIPP? We always talk about is like, does this grant fit into our 5-year plan? If not, if we really have to force it, then we, it's, as I said before, the squeeze is not worth, or the juice isn't worth the squeeze.
Yeah, makes sense. And to both of you, grants obviously inevitably come to an end. So how do you plan for sustainability once the grant funds run out? And let's start with you this time, Tamara.
That's a great question. Well, I think, as we mentioned before, we fund things that are already established, right? So things that we already had funding for, and this federal grant is just like either scaling it in some way or helping us evaluate the program in some way. For CSP, it's a startup grant, so sustainability isn't much as an issue because it funds the initial startup of a school, and then after the startup money runs out, like enrollment and per pupil funding, like the school should be able to function, and it should be financially viable after startup funding ends. So that's not an issue with seed. Again, because it was funding programs we had fundraised for before in the past and were more established, and it was really just providing that kind of external validation to it. I think we're still doing leadership development now, and so it was just we approached having that grant like adding some fuel to the fire that was already burning. And so once that grant ended, like our leadership development program is still continuing. So it added some fuel, but I guess it the program can financially sustain itself, and that maybe is to go back to the earlier question, that is also a consideration when you think about whether or not you should apply or not, is like, if we don't have this funding after the grant ends, is this something KIPP still wants to do and fund after the end of the grant? And then thinking about sustainability, again, as I mentioned, like the outcome that came out of, so we've had 2 seed grants. And the first one, we had good outcomes come out of it, and we used the data and the outcomes from that grant to apply for a second grant. So that was like, oh, we got another seed grant because we got good outcomes from the first one, and that helped us apply for our second seed grant. So that's another way you can think of it as well.
Yeah, that's great. Burak, same question. How do you plan for sustainability?
Yeah, I mean, Tamara already shared great insights. Just to add to that, I think the important thing is to always think about grant projects in long term, not just during the life of that particular grant. So we always think like, how can we institutionalize these practices so that they don't die out after the grant fund expires? And the best way to sustain grant programs is to build internal capacity. So oftentimes when rolling out and maturing these grant programs, we rely on sometimes external partnerships, strategic partners. So when we form these strategic partnerships, we always form them in a way that while they help us with the design, rollout, and implementation of these projects, they should also like intentionally build our own capacity to carry on those services, those practices without relying on contracts in the future. And also planning and timing future grant applications to build on that existing momentum of previous grant accomplishments. Just like Tamara's seed example, we've done that with our TSL. Our second cycle was definitely built upon that first one. And that really helps with sustaining them with improvements and new iterations. And
Yeah.
I think Tamara also mentioned this. This was really important. Whatever ideas or projects you put in the application, always aligning them to your business model, to your strategic priorities is definitely helpful. And it also pays off in the long run when trying to sustain those projects, because it's in our future plans, it's in our vision. It wasn't just a project that was created for the sake of securing this grant.
Yeah, so it sounds like for both of you, applying for grants that really make sense for your schools and community is really key. I just have one more question for you all. Is there anything else that you would want to tell a prospective applicant or a school leader who's thinking about applying about how to assess their internal capacity or what to think about as they decide to apply for a federal grant? And I'll go to you first, Tamara.
My only other advice, if you don't have the internal capacity, is to partner with another organization that does and has a track record of getting federal grants. And so I'll share kind of the opposite happened to us recently, where normally we apply for seed grants or federal grants ourselves. We stay within our little network, but recently an organization that got a more recent seed grant approached us because they wanted to implement an intervention in some of our schools and regions, and they wanted to they would be the prime recipient and we would be their partner for their seed program. So that is another way, if you don't have the internal capacity, or if you're just a smaller organization or school system, you can partner with a larger organization, and they have the capacity to manage the federal funding, and you're just a partner in their project. That's my other piece of advice there.
Yeah, that's a great option especially for a smaller school or organization. Burak, same question. Anything you want to tell prospective applicants as they think about applying?
I would say, don't just apply for the sake of securing additional funding. The main intent should be to implement robust projects that would serve your students, your educators, and your communities well. And these should be projects you should plan and roll out anyways, with or without grant funding. Because when you operate within this mentality, you attract both philanthropic funds and make it easier to secure competitive federal grants. And that we earlier mentioned that alignment to the strategic priorities, because that really sends the message to the peer reviewers who score your application that there's this big picture thinking here. A lot of dots are being connected. This is not just a series of discrete projects to secure funding. There's a big game plan here, and those are the proposals that score really well and make it honestly a safe bet for a successful potential grantee in the eyes of the departments.
Yeah, so it sounds like whatever project you're proposing needs to be authentic to where you're headed as an organization, and that it's really going to serve your kiddos well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you so much to both of you for joining us today. Thank you, Dr. Burak Yilmaz and Tamara Cheng, for joining us, for sharing your expertise, for giving us this hour of your life, and speaking to us about the Harmony Public Schools and KIPP Foundation competitive federal grants today.